Imagine a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where houses stand side by side like old friends, sharing fences and the occasional wave hello. But beneath that peaceful surface, hidden truths can lurk, waiting to shatter the calm. Picture a young woman stepping into her childhood home once more, ready to watch over it while her parents embark on the adventure of a lifetime. She's excited for the solitude, the chance to dive into her art, to unwind in familiar surroundings. Little does she know, a shadow from next door is about to turn her world upside down. This isn't just any neighbor. Oh no, this is a man who seems charming at first glance with his homemade cakes and warm smiles, but harbors secrets that chill the soul. As days turn to weeks, unease creeps in, building like a storm on the horizon. Whispers of discomfort, fleeting glances that linger too long, and then the unimaginable discovery that peels back layers of deception. What would you do if your privacy was invaded in the most intimate ways? If trust in those around you crumbled like dry leaves underfoot? This tale pulls you into the heart of betrayal, resilience, and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim your peace. It's a reminder that sometimes, the monsters aren't in far-off lands. They're right next door, baking treats with hidden intentions. And as we journey through this story together, you'll feel the tension rise, the emotions swirl, much like the waves on that distant cruise ship. If you're joining us for the first time, I invite you to subscribe right now and become part of our warm community of story lovers. We have so many more heartfelt tales waiting just for you. This all unfolded about a year ago, and goodness, I never imagined my family, and I would face something so deeply unsettling. It began when my dear parents, fresh into their retirement years, chose to dip into their savings for a wonderful 6-month cruise around the world. Cruises aren't my favorite way to relax, but seeing their faces light up with excitement warmed my heart, and I was truly happy for them. Even more fortunate, my apartment lease ended right before they set sail, so I could stay in their home the whole time looking after things. This eased my mother's mind tremendously. Otherwise, she'd have been fretting constantly, phoning me or my brother every few moments to make sure everything was all right. With me there, she could finally let go and enjoy herself. Oh, if only she had known what was coming. In those days leading up to their departure, as I settled my belongings back into my old room from childhood, preparing for the months ahead, my mother walked me through the house routines as though I'd never lived there before. I listened politely, though my mind wandered a bit through her familiar reminders. Yes, I remember the kitchen setup. Yes, the internet code is the same. Yes, the television works just as it always has. Yes, the spare room holds Aunt Joni's paintings while she's sorting out her life between marriages, and I promise not to touch them. But one thing caught my ear, the new neighbor she mentioned. His name was Mr. Samuels, and he'd settled in a few months earlier. To hear my mother tell it, he was like a gift from above, the kindest soul imaginable. Though he was just a bit older than my father, she described him as this gentle, sweet elderly gentleman who baked delightful treats for everyone around. She warned me he might stop by with muffins or perhaps a lovely red velvet cake. I'll confess, red velvet is a weakness of mine, so I warmed to the idea of him a little. She also noted he had a caregiver visiting every couple of days, so no need for me to concern myself with his well-being. Worrying was her specialty, after all. I hadn't met Mr. Samuels yet, as he was off visiting family when my parents left. So I saw them off at the port, giving them heartfelt goodbyes, though not quite with dramatic tears and waving cloths like in old movies. Then, I returned to the house, eager for 6 months of focusing on my freelance artwork and enjoying all the streaming channels they paid for that I couldn't afford myself. Mr. Samuels came back a short while into my peaceful solo time. And let me tell you, the soft, neighborly figure I'd pictured in my mind, like a kindly grandfather from stories, couldn't have been further from reality. At 75, he carried himself with the strength of someone who'd served in the military. Turns out he had in the Navy SEALs no less, and he clearly kept up with workouts in his own home gym. He was sturdy, spoke with assurance, and had this unexpected appeal. At first, I puzzled over why he'd need regular nursing care. But when I spotted the nurse arriving for her visit, it dawned on me that my mother sometimes sees the world through rose-tinted glasses. This nurse was the sort hired for special relaxation. Services easing stresses in ways that go beyond standard medical care, if you catch my meaning. Still, he was unattached, and age doesn't erase one's personal needs. Every other day at his stage of life, it left me quietly impressed. True to my mother's words, he did create wonderful baked goods, and soon after returning, he brought over a cake as a welcoming gesture, introducing himself properly. While his manner was engaging, something about him sent a chill through me, making me uneasy deep down. As a woman in my early 30s facing this robust older man who could clearly handle himself, I sensed his interest crossing lines. He wasn't subtle about it, gazing in a way that felt invasive, like he was imagining more than polite conversation. Comments slipped out, such as noting how my mother never mentioned her daughter being so attractive, or wishing he'd met her at my age. In another context, it might have felt complimentary, but his intensity made it feel overpowering, almost predatory. He had this presence that silently asserted dominance, the kind I'd encountered in younger men since my teens, but never from someone so much my senior, not this silver-haired force of nature that stuck in my thoughts like a persistent shadow. Fortunately, our interactions stayed limited, mostly to those occasional treats he delivered. Eventually, though, I grew wary and started discarding them, fearing he might tamper with the ingredients. I'd seen a quick video online about someone doing something truly awful that way, and it planted seeds of doubt in my mind. Reflecting now, I'm thankful I trusted that instinct. After about a month of immersing myself in creative projects and reaching out for more assignments, the quiet started to wear on me, stirring a restlessness I hadn't anticipated. Surprisingly, my mother didn't check in as often as I'd thought she would, and I found myself longing for their familiar, lighthearted presence. We managed some video calls, but the ship's connection was spotty at best, turning conversations into choppy, delayed exchanges where she'd repeat, "What did you say, dear?" endlessly. She always shortened my name, Celeste, to something affectionate like that. To lift my spirits and surprise them upon return, I took on tidying up the allowable areas of the house. Aunt Joni's artwork remained untouched, but the attic was a jumbled mess begging for organization. Plus, I hoped to uncover nostalgic treasures from our younger days, perhaps even items of value like my brother's vintage games and toys that could fetch a decent price. As artists, we both could use the extra funds. It didn't take long up there to realize two things. This task would demand far more effort than I'd planned, and strangely, a section of the wall separating our attic from the next had been cut away. Naturally, that next space belonged to Mr. Samuels. Wires trailed through the opening, weaving among stored boxes and holiday items, leading me to a shocking find. Fresh drill marks in the floor, with sawdust still scattered, guided those cables downward into the house. Without delving into the specifics, I followed them to reveal hidden devices in the washroom and my sleeping quarters, disguised as ordinary detectors for smoke. Creeping carefully into his side, I located a computer displaying live views from both spots. The angle in my room captured everything, and in the bath, it focused right on the bathing area. In essence, this supposedly kind elderly man had been secretly observing me for who knows how long, breaching my personal space in the most revolting manner imaginable. I closed the viewing window and spotted a collection labeled as the highlights. What I saw inside left me shaken to my core. Clips captured me in private moments, bathing, dressing, and even times when I sought personal comfort alone. Without pausing to think, overcome by revulsion, I erased the entire set and cleared it permanently, only to regret it instantly as a foolish choice. Deep down, perhaps my mind shielded me from involving authorities, and I'll explain more on that soon. I craved not just payback, but for him to dwell in dread of it. First, I cut the connections to those devices. Next, I contacted a trusted acquaintance skilled in technology. He provided a program to load onto the machine using a portable drive, one that would ruin not only that device but any link through the same network beyond repair, he assured. I should note Mr. Samuels was away again, supposedly with family returning soon. I acted quickly, following the steps to install it, then waited patiently for his homecoming. His reaction was unmistakable. A mechanical voice echoed loudly from above, repeating a damning phrase about his actions and twisted interests. I heard his frantic movements until he silenced it momentarily by closing the device. Footsteps rushed downward, likely to another machine, and soon the voice resumed. My contact explained it embedded deeply, untouchable without expert knowledge, surviving even full resets. I doubted Mr. Samuels possessed such skills, despite his setup prowess. Indeed, soon his broken equipment appeared curbside for disposal, ignored by collectors due to rules, drawing complaints from the community until he dealt with it. I'm certain he pointed suspicion my way, as the treats ceased and he dodged my gaze in passing. Yet the violation lingered, sickening me that he'd exploited my unguarded moments. I comforted myself knowing time wasn't on his side, but dreams haunted me of those recordings shared widely. Even reminding myself of their poor quality, offering no clear identification, didn't ease the worry, especially since he knew my details. Nothing further occurred, but sharing with my friend led to one more suggestion. A package arrived containing a mobile device. He instructed slipping it through his mail slot late at night without details on its contents, saying ignorance protected me. I did as asked. Whatever it held transformed him into a hermit. My remaining time passed smoothly, and eventually the caregiver visits ended too. He deserved no comforts. When my parents returned, I kept silent, too embarrassed and fearful my gentle father might react violently, risking his freedom over protecting me. A few months after settling into my new place, my mother shared that Mr. Samuels had moved to a care home, his mind fading rapidly in under a year. I stayed quiet, hiding my satisfaction. I question if avoiding officials was wise, opting for our unconventional path. But in my younger years, I endured an attack, and the authorities' response blamed me for my choices in attire, drinks, and friendliness. Not all are that way, I know, but the trauma lingered, making the thought of proving my case against an older neighbor daunting, despite evidence. Perhaps our approach crossed lines morally, but considering his capabilities even now, I shudder at his past deeds. Knowing he ends his days in decline, cared for him personally, brings me peace. I remain vigilant, checking for hidden eyes because caution is key. So many years ago, my parents still lived in the house that I grew up in as a child. The neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Morris, stuck out to me as a kid as a regimental, stern couple. Now, Mr. Morris was the type of man you can only describe as blustering, and Mrs. Morris was sort of like a human square with a bold haircut and a mustache almost as bushy as her husband. Now, if this sounds like being uncharitable to them, hell yeah, I definitely am. And you'll hate these two by the end of the story as well. Unless you're a psychopath, in which case, may I suggest that you live in a cabin in the woods without neighbors. The Morrises were sternly friendly with my parents. While me and my siblings grew up, they had this son, August, who was in the Scouts with my elderly brother, Barry, and he was sort of like a mini version of his father, Bossy, always demanding to be the leader of the activities, and would become quietly red-faced, angry if things didn't go his way. Us kids in the neighborhood had a nickname behind his back, and that of a certain Austrian dictator that I don't think you're allowed to say on YouTube, but let's just say that he's someone that you will not see very often. Now, anyway, the son isn't the point here. He was sent off to military boarding school at some point during high school, and the wild thing is that he bragged about asking to be sent there. And so we just grew up around the Morrises, who were pretty stern but polite and mostly just sort of kept to themselves. Occasionally, they'd complain if our music was too loud or if we had a barbecue that ran past 9:00 p.m., and if any of mine or my siblings' balls went into the neighbor's garden or over the boundary hedge, well, you could kiss that goodbye. They would return it, but they would puncture it. My dad asked them why they did this once, and they claimed that the balls always hit some sharp object in their garden, and there was nothing they could do about it. What was their garden made of? Spiked pits or something? Now, eventually, my brother Barry moved out for college. And then a couple of years later, so did I, and then a couple of years after that, Andy moved out to go traveling. And that just left my parents and our much, much younger sibling, Sammy, who was only 10 when I was 20. Now, one day, my mom FaceTimed me in tears, telling me that they were being taken to court by the Morrises. And when I got her to calm down and Dad joined the call, they explained that they'd received a legal letter from the neighbors explaining that our boundary hedge had been encroaching on their land for years, and that my family owed them over $400,000 in reparations for lost revenue for use of the land as expansion for an unspecified business. Now, the reason they called me first was because I was studying law at the time. Immediately, this rang a million alarm bells in my head, and I asked them what distance the hedge was supposedly encroaching on the neighbor's land, and they very meekly told me 1 in. And I asked them to scan the letter and send it over. I did some research, called a few friends, and discovered that, much as I suspected, the law firm representing the Morrises not only was not reputable, but in fact entirely imaginary. The Morrises had invented their own law firm and sent a fake threatening letter. And my biggest confusion was why. It was obvious that my parents wouldn't just pay $400,000 without seeking legal counsel. And the answer came a couple of days later when a second letter from the fraudulent law firm arrived. They presented an offer that the bill would be dropped if my parents would agree to shift the boundary hedge 10 ft back, granting a much larger boundary to the neighbors as a sort of cost-free compensation to avoid any monetary demands. Now, this was something that, knowing my parents, if they didn't have a daughter who was a lawyer in training, they may have agreed to that just for a quiet life. Now I worked it out using some land blueprints and contacted the relevant offices, and discovered that the Morris had applied for an extension to their house and purchased a prefab guest house. But both projects would require them to encroach into my parents' land. And so, at the time, I happened to be dating an older guy who's now my husband who worked for a law firm specializing in this kind of thing. And he did some digging and checked out some old records. And it turned out that the boundary hedge was in fact around a foot into my parents' property. Meaning, if anything, the Morses had been encroaching on our land this entire time. My boyfriend drafted an actual legitimate legal document stating this with the relevant proof. And the letter ended with a confirmation that my family was simply letting things be as long as the Morrises did the same to avoid any kind of escalation. We hoped that being caught red-handed would cause these fools to drop their lies. Clearly, we underestimated just how badly they wanted their extension or how much money they dropped on this back garden prefab, presumably non-refundable. However, their next move didn't take the form of fake lawyers or legal threats at all. Instead, my parents started receiving notes written like ransom letters with the letters cut out of various magazines. I'm not joking. They made strange, bizarre threats such as a promise to kill our pet miniature donkey, something we never even owned. And another letter threatened to poison the koi in our pond. We don't have a pond or koi. The letters were so ridiculous that my parents kept copies but didn't report them to the police. Not at first. But then they became threatening. My parents wouldn't show me the notes directly, but they let slip that the notes names myself and my brothers. And then finally, a note arrived promising that Sammy would never arrive home from school one day when they least expected it, which is when they finally went to the cops. And of course, the cops couldn't prove that the notes came from the Morrises. This harassment went on for 5 years. Acts of petty vandalism, weird pieces of graffiti on the walls of the house. Hoses were clipped in the middle of the night with the faucet running so the yard flooded. Dead birds and roadkill being left on the doorstep. And the Morrises, these clever idiots, obviously made themselves the victims of their own harassment too, so suspicion didn't fall on them. And then the fire started. Just small contained fires in the backyard that scorched the lawn. Another classic was that the Morrises would play classical music at full volume at 3:33 a.m. in the morning every single Wednesday. And when it was time for Sammy's exams, they escalated it to every day. My parents filed noise complaints, but the Morrises denied any involvement and in fact claimed that they hated classical music. And when investigators were there, somehow they mysteriously managed to know, and the music didn't play on those nights. My eldest brother moved home and in no uncertain terms threatened the Morrises. The C-words had the gall to call the cops on him, and this further undermined our claims against them. They went so far as to try and suggest that my brother was the one committing the vandalism, despite the fact that he'd been living in a totally different state during most of the incidents and had an alibi for most of it. Now Sammy, meanwhile, was becoming an absolute wreck, and we all felt so hopeless, and it felt like the whole world was against us. In the end, the entire family got together for a family meeting. And we very tearfully decided that the only recourse that we had was to move out of our family home that had been in the family since my mom's childhood. So that's what we did. We put the house up for sale. My parents accepted the first offer they received, and they moved into a smaller house that realistically was more manageable for them, especially once Sammy went away to college. There's no happy ending here, really, at least not for us. The lesson is simply that sometimes it's better to walk away than let your entire life be taken up with fighting the fight, even if it is a just and good one. There is an ending, though, but I can't say it's a good one. And as much as I hated the Morrises for what they put us through, I wouldn't wish this on anyone. Remember their son who willingly went to military school and we nicknamed that Austrian painter? Well, it turns out that Augie had been thrown out of military school, then dishonorably discharged from the military, all without his parents' knowledge. He'd fallen into drugs and violence, and one day he came home. Augie held his parents at gunpoint with a sawed-off shotgun, zip-tied them back to dining chairs, and then he and a couple of associates robbed the Morrises of every valuable they could get their hands on. And then, as a parting gift with a butt of that saw-off, he shattered both of his father's kneecaps. Nobody knows what caused Augie to hate his parents so much. It's probably not hard to guess, but when he was caught, he kept quiet. And he was caught a few days later as he admitted to what he'd done, but not why he'd done it. He was sent to prison for quite a few years, and Mrs. Morris died shortly after, poetically said to have died of a broken heart. Mr. Morris spent the rest of his years in a hospice unable to walk, and also never uttered a single word again since that night. And so the new neighbors who bought our family home never had to deal with the neighbors from hell. And the whole story is a reminder of just how incompletely messed up and pointless the motivations of some people can be. How they can live with themselves when they all cause so much pain. And how when you cause pain to others, sometimes it returns to you tenfold. I don't know if I believe in karma, but in this case, I can't help but feel that no matter how much the Morais screwed with my family, they got far more than they deserved. And I can only hope Augie can one day find some peace. So recently I moved into an apartment block in a pretty artsy area of a pretty artsy neighborhood. Now I won't dox myself, but you can probably guess one of two places I mean, and it's not the New York one. I love this apartment building. It was more of a boarding house, really. Only 8 apartments and the top floor belonging to the building super. And all the neighbors were really friendly, and most of us were artists of some sort. And there was me, a painter. And then we had a singer, a couple of writers, 2 more painters, and a mixed media artist. And apparently a sculptor. The sculptor was the neighbor directly across from me. Nobody knew his name or even if he definitely was a he. He just went by the moniker TT, all capital. The rest of us would often have sort of group brainstorm evenings where we'd chat about art and set the world to rights in the common room or TV room that we all shared on the ground floor. Triple T never joined us, of course, and soon the mysterious sculptor became the subject of fascination for a group of creatives with hefty imaginations and too much time on our hands. Obviously, nearly all of the theories about TTT's true identity were ridiculous. Most of them were supernatural. And one of the painters absolutely swore that Triple T was Shia LaBeouf and claimed that she'd seen him when he moved in. And when we showed her a photo of Shia LaBeouf, though, she said it was the other Shia LaBeouf. And we can never quite work out what she actually meant by that. One of the writers decided that Triple T was a ghost, like in the movie Ghost, and that his sculptures were all clay pots, and he was waiting for his Demi Moore to sit at the pottery wheel so he could finally create again. The singer claimed that Triple T was a beautiful woman whose face had been disfigured in a terrible car accident, which explained why some of her sculptures displayed in local galleries showed various figures in states of damage. Me, I just thought the Triplet T was a reclusive sculptor who valued their privacy. And whenever TTT had a new sculpture to display, it would be found standing outside their apartment, and men in some suits from a certain gallery would come to collect it. Triple T always displayed at the same gallery, which I can't name for the same reason as not wanting to reveal myself. I did try knocking on Triple T's door a few times. Once or twice, I heard signs of life, and one time I was absolutely certain that I was being watched through a peephole and just a gut feeling, but it did make me shiver. But if Triple T wasn't answering, I wasn't going to keep prying in there. And that's why it shocked me when one Friday evening I stepped out of my apartment ready to attend one of our weekly brainstorming sessions only to see T's apartment door open a crack. Only darkness spilled from within and I didn't want to enter without permission. So I just said hello through the gap. No answer, although I was sure that I heard movement inside. The door was open. Someone could be in trouble. I thought that was just sort of a justification enough to take a peek inside. Right. And I turned on the flashlight app on my phone, but covered it with my palm just in case. And when I stepped inside, it was completely pitch black in there. I raised my phone, warning whoever was in there that I was about to light up the room. And then I slowly moved my hand away from the lens. I was not prepared for what I saw. The room was entirely bare. The walls and floor were sealed in plastic wrap. You know, the kind that they use in Dexter or some serial killer movies when they're about to kill someone in a room and don't want to leave blood splatter. And that wasn't the creepy part, though. The real creepy part was the statue that stood in the center of the room. It wasn't some kind of horror mannequin. It wasn't some horrific effigy of myself or anything else in the building. It was a classic-looking statue of the Holy Mother Mary, the kind that you find in the Catholic Church. The only strange thing about her was that instead of a normal face, she'd been painted up to look like, of all things, a mime. I can't explain it, but I was absolutely certain that the statue was watching me. I was certain somehow the Triple T was the statue. The statue was Triple T. I took a tentative step forward and tapped the Mary statue. It was porcelain. And against my better judgment, I started to reach up and touch the face. It looked like flesh, and it looked so much like human flesh. My fingertips were less than an inch away, and I was about to touch it. I was about to touch TTT. And then I heard a noise in the room behind me. It was sort of like a muffled cry, like the word help. And I snatched my hand back from that statue and hurried to the door directly behind the statue. It was the only door in the room. grabbed the door handle and twisted it. The door was locked, but the moment I twisted the door open, I heard a loud shattering crash behind me. Quickly whipping around, I saw the Mother Mary statue shattering and collapsing to the floor. I had no idea what to do. Had I just destroyed some priceless artifact? I walked up to that debris as carefully as I could, and the face was just laying there. And I've been right. It was skin, sort of. It was a latex ball with Mary's face painted on it. And then a voice spoke from an unseen speaker somewhere in the room. "I am TTTT. This is Art. You are the Art. Please leave." And so I left. I left and ran down the stairs and cursed myself a million times for not filming what I just seen. I told everyone what had happened and we all rushed upstairs. But TTT's door was once again locked. And once again I was certain that as we all stood there, someone was watching us through that peephole. And 2 days later, there was a small portable safe left outside of TTT's apartment, and the same guys in suits came to collect it. 2 days later after that, I received a gilded invitation in the mail to attend a private showing at Gallery redacted before it opened to the public. And the invite was from Triplet T themselves. Of course, I went, hoping to meet the reclusive sculptor. No such luck. Triplet T's agent was there, and informed me that Triplet T's final piece was being unveiled that night. Unlike all their other pieces, it was a video. It was a video showing me entering the apartment, a black bar across my face to protect my identity. It showed me from various camera angles, cameras that must have been hidden in the walls and the ceiling. And then it showed me from the perspective of Mother Mary's eyes. And for a second, just a few frames, the sensor bar disappeared and my face was replaced by that of a skull. And then it showed me rushing for the door. And here the camera split into two joint shots, one showing me turning the door knob. The other showed the statue trembling and collapsing, clearly triggered by some kind of mechanism in the door. Then the rest mostly played out how I described it. Except as I picked up Mother Mary's head again, the sensor bar disappeared from my face and this time briefly showed an angel like a Greek sculpture. And the final shot of the video was simply text saying, "Life is clay and you are all my sculpture. Goodbye, TT." That was the only time the video was shown. I've tried to track down a copy for this last year. If anyone out there has any leads at all, please let me know in the comments. But holy crap, this was the creepiest and most bizarre thing to happen to me. And I am obsessed with getting a copy of this video. If anyone has any leads, anyone at all, please comment. I need to see it again. I need to understand why Triple T was trying to say this and what it says about me. All the other artists in the boarding houses have theories, and I'll leave you to make up your own. But there's one thing I've learned from all of this. One universal truth that speaks to us all in our very soul. Artists are freaking weird, man. Do any of you have someone who you'll never forget, even though you never really knew them that well? Someone who was a constant in your life, just sort of a background character who isn't around anymore. Someone you find your mind drifting back to every now, and then because even though you didn't know them that much, you just saw them all the time, and they were like an interactive, friendly part of the furniture. Now, I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's like a beloved lazy boy that you get from Goodwill. You don't know its backstory, and you never will. And you don't ask about its past, and it doesn't ask about yours. Christ, this sounds dehumanizing, but it's how I think about it. It's in a fond, loving way, trust me. And I hope one day I'm someone else's Goodwill lazy boy, someone who touched a person's life just by being there and someone they'll always remember. Now I remember Mr. Browning. I'll never forget him. And even though the last time I saw him was probably 1985, I think I remember him fondly regardless of how things ended. Now, I sure know that I always thought fondly whenever this guy crossed my mind. Me and the wife often talked about how we should invite him over for dinner. We wondered if he was lonely after his wife had passed a decade or so before, and we wondered if his adult kids called often because they never seemed to visit. But we just never got around to asking Mr. Browning. Hell, I don't even remember what his Christian name was. It was always, "Good morning, Mr. Browning." And he'd respond with, "Good morning, Ted." He was my elder. We understood the hierarchy. And I do know that he was a former teacher, so maybe he thought of himself as Mr. Browning. Maybe it didn't even cross his mind to ask me. To call him by his first name, Amos, that was it, Amos Browning, and I remember from his obituary and later the funeral. And I think those were the only times that I heard his first name spoken and one of the only times that I saw his adult children. His son was a very doughy-faced man who looked bored to be at his father's funeral. His daughter was one of those sharp-faced women with a meek, sycophantic husband and the kind of bratty son who wanted to be the center of attention, even at Grandpa's wake. We didn't stay long. We'd gone to pay our tributes to Mr. Browning, but we couldn't stay. We didn't want his family asking us questions about his death, and they likely knew that I'd been present when it happened, and I'm not a good liar. I would have struggled to give them the answers they wanted instead of the horrible, haunting, traumatizing truth. Me and Mr. Browning used to chat over the fence. Well, I'd lean over the fence and he'd mow the lawn, and he was always mowing his lawn. He had one of those old push mowers, an electric one, and I just kept trying to persuade him to buy a ride-on, but he said his yard was way too small for that. It wasn't. And besides, at his age, probably early, sevens, it was a great way to get some exercise and a little peace and quiet. Peace and quiet from who? I'm not really sure, since he lived alone after his wife had passed before me and my family moved in. But that's what he said. We talk a lot but never really get to know each other, you know. We talked about the Detroit Lions a bunch. He was a diehard supporter and I was just a pretty casual one. And we talked about the weather. We talked about politics, but never too seriously. And sometimes we'd watch the same shows at the same time and we'd talk about those too. We both loved Miles Davis and The Who and Kiss. And he told me about his first ever concert, sneaking in to watch Kiss play. But I was never sure if he was telling the truth or just recounting the plot of that one movie where that exact thing happens. It was a fun story anyhow, even if he told me about 5 times. And occasionally he'd ask about my wife and how she was doing and how her job was going. But I think he wanted to talk about his wife in exchange, but couldn't bring himself to do so, apart from that one time. Sometimes my wife would bring him a lasagna or some other baked goods, and he'd thank her like a perfect gentleman. And he always handed the dishes back to me over the fence. Never once brought them to our door, always over the fence. Now I chatted to him so much that by the time we moved out, there was a groove in the ground where grass had stopped growing in the place where I had always stood to talk to Mr. Browning. Now I remember exactly what we were talking about on the day it happened. My wife had just had a minor operation to remove a benign cyst from her breast, and he was asking how she was doing. I told him she was doing fine and would be home from the hospital the next day or even that evening, if things went well. Mr. Browning looked at me then as he was mowing the lawn, and then told me that I was lucky and I should hold on to a good woman like that. And then he said, and I'll never forget it, not least because they were his last words, he said, "I miss her so much." And then he sort of looked down away like he was about to hide tears, but I saw a look of alarm and then fear across his face. Maybe I'm just imagining, but I swear that I saw him try and stop the forward motion of the mower as he pushed forward. I'm not sure at how it happened. He was always so careful, running the electrical extinction cable around the edge of the lawn, making sure that he was mowing nowhere near it, being careful like it was muscle memory. But I heard the crunch and whir of the motor running over the electrical socket and the cable. And I don't know how or why, but there was no grounding. The mower's rubber handles just sort of weren't there anymore, and the live electrical cables got tangled into the motor blades, mangling and electrifying the mower as Mr. Browning held on to it. And hold on to it he did. I watched in abject frozen horror as his body began to convulse as smoke rose up from his hands where he was gripping the metal handle. I could smell the cooking flesh and electrical burn. I watched as the grass around him singed and blackened, and I knew I had to knock him away from the mower but couldn't touch him myself. I searched for something, anything that I could safely use to shove him off the mower. My eyes settled on my old wooden baseball bat, but by the time I'd hauled myself over that fence, I knew it was too late. Mr. Browning had collapsed the ground, finally letting go of the lawn mower, and I knew that there was no saving him. So I ran over to the outlet and switched off the electricity. Then I went back over to my neighbor, my friend who I knew so little about, and he was blackened and charred. His face was horrific. His eyeballs had somehow survived the electrocution, and they stared white and frozen out of a face that looked like it had been sucked clean from the inside. One detail I remember, one grim detail, is how his mouth was open, and how I realized that he had false teeth because they had fallen down into his throat. I ran into his house and called 911, and the rest was a blur of paramedics and police and being questioned. And at first, when his daughter got there, she seemed to somehow blame me for her father's death, as if she had ever given a crap about him in life. It may not have opened up to me, but Mr. Browning certainly made it clear that his kids did not play a big part in his life. And so, fast forward to the funeral. The son gave a eulogy, and it was like he barely knew his father any better than I did. It made me so sad and devastated that this man who seemed like nothing but a nice, amicable gentleman could have been so forgotten and discarded, except for the neighbor who gave him some friendly, superficial banter over the fence. The same neighbor who was forced to watch him die. I swore then that when I had a kid, I would do everything I could to make sure that they wanted me in their life forever. And as it turned out, my wife was unknowingly pregnant at the time of that funeral. We had a son and then later 2 daughters, and they were the loves of my life. They're all grown themselves now with families of their own, and my wife and I are grandparents, and we make sure to keep our family close, regular meals together, Christmas and Thanksgiving being particularly huge affairs. Now, maybe Mr. Browning hadn't been a great father. It's not for me to judge his kids for distancing themselves from him. I don't judge them for their relationship with her father. It just sort of makes me sad. But before the sadness came the trauma. We bought her home with the intention of starting a family there. But every time I so much as stepped foot in the backyard, I was met with flashbacks of Mr. Browning cooking alive. I could smell that electric burn and see those bulging dead eyes. We made a loss selling, but we moved, and my son was born in a smaller house, but it was one filled with love and closeness. And I was no longer haunted by the sight of my neighbor's final moments, at least not directly. Like I said, I'll always remember Mr. Browning, and part of that means being cursed with remembering how I played witness to his demise. If you've ever dealt with difficult neighbors or felt the weight of unspoken regrets, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments below, and let's connect over these shared experiences. Like this video if these stories touched your heart in some way, and pass it along to a friend who might appreciate a good tale of life's twists and turns. What do you imagine lies ahead in stories like these? Drop your ideas in the comments, and remember to tap that notification bell so you catch every new narration we share.